I'm Peter Kolb. I'm the MSU Extension forestry specialist. I've been working in Northern Rockies forests now for 35 years. Aside from looking at overall forest ecology and forest management, post-fire forest evaluation and rehabilitation is one of the things I've been doing for over 30 years. So we're doing this seminar tonight for folks that were impacted by wildfire to try and give you some methodology of what to look for on your trees and your landscape to assess the severity of the fire, which means how poorly or how well is vegetation going to come back onto your property, and also look at some techniques that will help mitigate some of the most severe fire effects. Okay, and so I produced a 19-page handout here that's a photo guide, and so everything that we're going to cover here on this PowerPoint is in this guide. And so it's a reference, and like I said, it kind of follows along with this. If you want to download this guide, it's on our webpage, which is that long-looking address on there, which is hard to copy down. But if you want to go the easy route, just Google MSU Extension Forestry Publications, and it'll be right on top, and it's called Wildfire Assessment Guide. Okay, there's a whole bunch of other publications that you might find interesting that pertain to forestry as well. Make sure the MSU is Montana State University, because there's also Michigan State and Mississippi State. But that's just Google MSU Extension Forestry Publications, and you can download this. Okay, it's a pretty good-sized document, so you've got to give your computer a little bit of time to download it. Okay, so without any further ado, and since this is live being broadcast, if you have questions, Tom, who is gracious enough to be running this, can you email or text questions, Tom?
You can. There's a Q&A and a chat box, and I'll keep an eye on that.
Okay, so Tom's going to be fielding questions. So as we go along, if you have questions and you're watching this live, then just type in those questions, and Tom will wave his hand at me and make me aware of your question, and I can try and address those. Okay? So, after fire burns through an area, there is really a two-step process in assessing what the fire did. And this is more geared towards forests and trees. So we want to assess the trees. So we look across there, and we have trees that are black, and trees that are red, and trees that are a combination of all those things. But then the second step is assessing the soils and the understory plants, because in this ecosystem we have trees, but we also have grasses and forbs and shrubs underneath those trees. And they all contribute to some sort of function out there, and they all react differently to fire. Okay? So I'm going to start out with looking at the trees, and then we'll go to a soil assessment and an overall landscape assessment in this process. So starting out, when we look at a tree, and this tree, so behind it was a pretty severe high-intensity fire, massive flames, and typically the flames are going to be 3 times as high as the fuel. So if we got 60-foot tall trees, we had a 180-foot wall of flame on those trees because they're torching out. This tree was not consumed by the fire, but the heat from that forest behind it, the radiant heat, was enough to kind of bake the needles in place. And we call that scorch. Okay? So we really want to assess the tree crown and see how severe is the scorch. Because if the heat on here is long enough duration that the needles and the branches can bake and die, but the needles aren't hot enough to be consumed. And typically, lethal temperature for living tissue is about 150 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 minute. Okay, that's when the tissue starts to die. The longer that temperature is there, the more of that tissue dies. Okay? Combustion occurs when the temperature reaches around 550 degrees Fahrenheit. So, almost 350 degrees warmer than that. So there's a wide range, and that heat's there for a long time. We can get plant and tissue death, okay? So first we kind of look at the crowns. The second step, there we go, is we want to assess this tree stem, because there are scenarios where the crown is intact, but there was so much heat down here that it baked the inner water and sugar conducting tissue in the tree, and there's nothing moving up or down through the stem, so the tree is essentially dead as well. Okay? The third step is sometimes we have a high fuel loading at the base, and that can be just a thick mat of needle accumulation. Okay? And that usually doesn't produce a lot of flame, but it smolders and it delivers heat for a long period of time. So we can get some real baking of the base of the tree, particularly where the roots start to enter the soil. And different tree species have different ways in which those roots enter the soil, and they're more susceptible, and I'll show you that. Okay? And then the final step is we want to look at the surrounding soil, because there's grasses, forbs, and shrubs in there, and they might survive or they might die as well. And the implications of that is a severe fire that kills all the vegetation can cause the entire soil to destabilize. When you get a rain or snow melt in the spring, and all the topsoil on the slope will ooze down and cause more damage. And statistically, there's actually more damage caused to homes and private property and infrastructure by the after effects of the fire, the flooding and the landslides and the mudslides. So that's part of the assessment and part of the rehabilitation process that we have to think about. And particularly in this case, the Bridger fire, it was on some steep ground. And so if you have steep ground that burned, you really have to think about, what am I going to do to help stabilize those slopes? Maybe I can just leave them alone, or maybe I need to do something. So those are the things we're going to look at. So we have fire-resistant tree species and trees that are not so fire-resistant. Okay, so in Montana, ponderosa pine and western larch are the most fire-resistant. They have thick bark that shields the inner growing tissue from heat damage. They, in the case of ponderosa pine, have long, thin, wispy needles that help disperse heat that hits them. In the case of larch, they're deciduous. That means they drop their needles in the fall. Okay? So if the needles are singed off on a larch, big deal. They're going to drop them anyways. Okay? And you know, they also have what are called heat shock proteins that they can develop. So these fire-resistant trees can take more heat than trees that are not fire-resistant. So when we're assessing the crowns, we look at different levels of scorch. So in this case, it was a surface fire, and the bottom branches got heat on them, and they died. Okay? For ponderosa pine and larch, 80 to 90% of those trees will survive. Not a big deal, they can handle that. Okay? So as we move higher in the scorch realm, so where half the tree is scorched, we start looking for potentially more damage. Okay? Now ponderosa pine can take almost 100% scorch and still survive under the right circumstances. Okay? Which is different than the other species that we have out there. Larch can take 100% scorch, because again, it's deciduous. Needles drop off. That's okay. As long as the buds are intact, it'll grow new needles in the spring. We don't have larch down here, so not something to worry about. One of the things we look at is the ends of branches. So in this case here, this was all scorched, but this is where the bud is, and these inner needles around there that are somewhat protected from that radiant heat by the longer needles survive. And we can look the same way at other tree species for the same thing. So in this case, the buds are juicy, they're flexible, they're protected. We know that in the spring, those buds will burst and we'll get new needles. Okay, so as long as there wasn't other damage to the branches and the stem, this tree will survive. Alternatively, here we have the bud on the end and the inner needles, they're brown. And the bud isn't even there because as soon as you touch it, it breaks off and falls off. It's dried out. Okay? That's dead. There's no regrowth going to occur on there. So if we look at the more fire-sensitive tree species that we have here, Douglas fir, Grant fir, Sabelle pine fir, lodgepole pine, limber pine, and white bark pine, or white pine, again, confined more to the northwestern Montana. You don't have those here. But all of those are thinner barked, flatter needles that overheat a little more easily. So we have a different scale. When we have a little bit of scorch on those, that's enough to start killing those trees. And on average, we'll have about only 50% survival. As we get more scorch, the survival rate goes dramatically down. And pretty typically, if the entire tree, Douglas fir, or Sabelle pine fir, or lodgepole pine is scorched like this, it's dead. As a ponderosa pine or larch, it has a chance of surviving, but those species do not. okay? So, and again, some like, so this is Douglas fir, can take a little bit more heat than subalpine fir. If you see this kind of scorch on a spruce or subalpine fir, it's probably dead. It's very thin bark, its inner stem, that inner cambial layer is very easily damaged by a little bit of heat. Okay, so different scale to use, but this is a first step. First we're going to look at the tree. Okay, so if I see a tree like this, the next thing I want to start looking at is the stem and the base to see if this tissue, this water conducting tissue, is still alive. But give you a few other examples. So, just to review. Yes, sir, question.
I'm just curious, across the area that burned, do you have some feel for the mix or the makeup of the trees?
Most was Douglas fir. Until you get higher up on the mountainside, then you start getting more into some subalpine fir and lodgepole pine. But most in the residential areas was Douglas fir, for the most part. Okay, so this is taken out. I was out yesterday and I incorporated some pictures. So this is what a lot of that area looks like. No question, these Douglas fir are dead. Not a chance, not any chance that they're going to survive. So the fire was in the crowns, and the scorch is so severe, there was fire in the crown, it might not have consumed all the needles. Okay, there's no way that these Douglas fir can survive. Okay, pretty simple. Now, we move on, and we see a lot of trees that look like this. They're severely scorched. These get a lot harder to tell. More than likely, they're going to die. There are some that might survive, and we want to look at them very carefully. And Douglas fir is pretty tricky, and there's other things we'll look at, okay? So keep this one in mind, this picture. And then we go into more this, where the top is still green, or this is one where this cloud of hot air stayed up high and it parked itself right from here on up, so it baked the top of the tree, but the bottom is green. Okay? So the Bridger Canyon fire was very unique fire behavior. It was very wind driven, okay, which made it an extremely dangerous fire, and that's why it went from 40 acres to 7,000 acres in 12 hours. So these, again, slightly higher chance of survival. The top is green, so we have the foliage there that can support the tree in the future. It may look different because all of these branches may die off, and so you're going to have a tree that kind of looks a little bit like a paintbrush with just the top green. But if that's all you have, also consider the important part that these trees have cones with viable seeds. So these trees are capable of producing seeds that are going to seed back in the site. Whereas a tree that's totally scorched or black, there are no viable seeds anymore. Okay? You're not going to get any trees back unless you plant them. Okay? So this gets on the spectrum where I'm a little more hopeful for these trees if the stem and if the base of the stem survive. And that we'll look at that next. Now, a few other things to look at, and we're starting to see this happen right now. This is back to ponderosa pine. I have a lot more experience with ponderosa pines than Douglas fir, because Douglas fir either live or they die, and not a whole lot in between. But one of the other indicators that you're going to start seeing right now already is where the needles were scorched and killed, but the branch tissue is still alive. That living branch tissue will start rejecting the injured needles, and they'll be dropping them. Okay? So we call this needle abscission. So this whole tree was scorched, but from here on up to here, I actually have a pointer to keep you from reaching out there. So from right here down to there, you notice that the branches have lost their needles. That is a very good indicator because it means the branches are alive and they're rejecting the fire-killed needles. Down below, these needles are staying on the branches. That means the branches are dead. The physiology cannot separate the needles anymore. They're just frozen in time. Okay? So, and where this is really important, so in past fires that had similar behavior to the Bridger Canyon fire with a lot of superheated gas moving around, we had trees that did this, okay? And the notion was they're dead. But we started noticing that some of them were upsizing their needles. You notice right up there? So they dropped all their scorched needles, which said, hey, those branches are still alive. Okay, so, and this was really important because these landowners were wanting to remove the dead trees, but they wanted to leave a tree that had the chance. And trying to figure that out, and in this case, you're going to lose all your trees because they're all scorched. So if, by golly, if it has a chance to survive, maybe I'll try and leave those and see what they do. And so we marked those trees that showed that needle abscission, and I tracked them, and the next spring, sure enough, that's the top. You see those green needles starting to come out on there. And 2 years later, these are the trees that were 100% scorched, that initially they were going to cut down, but after 2-3 years, they've regrown their needles. You can see the crowns are a lot smaller, and after 2 years, some of them are still holding on to their dead fire-killed needles. So this is after 2-3 years what it looked like, and so that landowner was very pleased that we figured this out, because they thought, I now live on a prairie. I don't live in a forest anymore. So we go back to Douglas fir. Okay, they're not as bold in what they do as ponderosa pine. A little hard to figure out, but here's what I've already been seeing out on the Bridger fire. So here's 2 trees that were scorched. This one and that one. Notice this one has no dead needles around it on the ground. And look at all the dead needles under this one. And so I examined these trees very carefully, and this tree on the left, all these branches are alive. It's living tissue there. So already now, what is it, 3 weeks since the fire blew through, 4 weeks, okay? The live tissue is abscising the injured needles. Whereas this tree is not dropping any, which pretty much, when I examined it, it's dead. It's scorched and all the branch tissue is dead. So when the trees are starting to drop needles, counterintuitively, that's a good indication. It means, hey, they're functioning, they're dropping the injured stuff. Okay, so let's move on in the next portion. Look at the stem. So again, I'm going to start with ponderosa pine just because that's where I have most of my examples. So this is a fire in eastern Montana that blew through, and you notice the top is pretty green. You think, oh, those trees are doing pretty well. But when I looked at the stem, all this pitch is coming out. And this is the following spring after the fire. It was pretty hot in here because there's a lot of fuel down beneath there. So all this pitch is a defense mechanism of a tree. An injured part of the tree is going to produce pitch. So when you see a lot of pitch oozing, it means there's damage. Okay? And when I excavated in that damaged area, we look at it a little closer, so let's take that area, and we'll blow it up a little bit more. So live sapwood and cambium tissue is white, creamy color. In Douglas fir, it has a little bit of a purplish tinge to it. Okay? And as soon as I injure it, I don't know if you can see that real well, but there's these droplets of pitch that are oozing out of the wood. Okay? That's because that's living tissue that I've just injured. So you scrape skin, you start bleeding. That's basically what the tree is doing. The darkened area was heat killed. So it's oxidized, it's dead. Okay? And the off-white is this kind of yellow, off-yellow color is also dead. It's just died a little slower, so it hasn't completely oxidized and turned brown yet. So this is what we look for on the stem. Okay? And we're not going to peel the bark off of every tree, because to determine whether the tree is alive, we're going to kill it by peeling the bark off. What we're going to, this is a big chunk, so I just did it to demonstrate. We peel off little quarter-sized pieces of bark, and we're going to see, do we hit this or do we hit that? Okay? And the most affected part of the tree is the uphill part of the stem, because the heat goes around and it's reflected back from the slope onto the stem. Or the part that has the char the highest. So you'll see the black goes up real high on one side and not high on the other. Always look at the most impacted site first. Because if the most impacted site has tissue like that, you don't need to look at the rest of the tree. It's good to go. Okay? If you do find this, now you need to find out how extensive does it go around the tree. Yes, sir?
Would that live sapwood, would that migrate, or is it just going to stay where it is?
Excellent question. So, when I looked at this tree, I tracked this tree, I still track it. That happened 20 years ago. So this is the tree 5 years later. And let's look at, this is the same injury that I did by excavating that. Let's look at it closer. So that living tissue, from your question, that living cambium will slowly start to grow over the injured area. We call that callus tissue. Okay? And ponderosa pine does that exceedingly well. as does larch. Douglas fir somewhat. And the tree is a little bit in a race because you get decay fungi that attack the tree and insects that will bore into the wood-boring insects. Ponderosa pine produces a pitch. Pitch is a toxin to insects and to fungi. Okay, so the tree seals it off. So this tree, and there's a lot of injury down here as well from the heat that you can't see on here. But it's all starting to grow that over again. So this tree, if we go back and look again, so that's right after the fire when I first found the damage. That's 5 years later, okay? So it's recovered really well, even though about 30% of that stem was heat impacted, okay? So ponderosa pine can take about 50% of its circumference damaged by heat and still survive. Douglas fir, maybe 30%. Spruce, about pine fir, maybe 10%. Because those species, the wood is more easily invaded by decay fungi and insects, and even though the tree survived the fire, the secondary pathogens that come in will take the tree out. Yes?
I know this is a different species, but on Doug fir, would you see that same kind of recovery in the lower section?
Yes.
That's been scorched?
Yes. But again, if it's 50% of the base of the Douglas fir, that wood will decay out before the Douglas fir can grow back over it. Okay? So that, you know, these are kind of general guidelines. Every fire is different. The way how it behaves, the length of heat, the physiological condition of the tree. So if a tree is really vigorous and really hydrated, it tolerates heat damage a lot more than a tree that's really stressed. Okay, so in one case it will survive, another one will die, and you go, huh, same kind of damage. But it has to do with how vigorous that tree was in the first place.
What about quaking aspen?
Pardon me?
Quaking aspen.
I'll get to that.
Okay.
That's another good question. But quaking aspen is a special case, and we'll talk specifically about quaking aspen. Yes, sir.
We just had a request to repeat the question next time.
Okay.
Uh,
So the question just was, what about quaking aspen? And I'll talk specifically about quaking aspen. And there was another question about Douglas fir.
Yeah, and the recovery of the scorch.
Right, yeah. So Douglas fir will do the same type of recovery. It's just not as robust as ponderosa pine or larch. It's kind of intermediate. So pine and larch can tolerate a lot of heat damage. Douglas fir can tolerate some damage. Grand fir, subalpine fir, spruce, white pine, lodgepole pine. I always joke that I can kill those trees with a big lighter. Okay, they're very sensitive to heat. So some people will argue, some scientists say, no, lodgepole pine's a lot more tolerant than you think. My personal opinion is it's not. I mean, you'll see some that were half-girdled and they stayed alive, but they just don't grow well after that. So we'll just review very quickly. So living tissue, creamy white, produces pitch. Okay? Damaged tissue, so this is a good contrast. So living tissue, damaged tissue, and it's varying changes. Okay, so this is really damaged. It turns dark brown real quickly. This is mildly damaged, but it's dying more slowly. It's yellow. It shouldn't be yellow. This is still going to die. It's not going to recover. Okay, so that's what we're looking for. And you got to develop a little bit of an eye for it while you're testing it, because, you know, is it red? Is it pink? You know, there's varying shades in there. So always look at the most heavily heat impacted site and then look on the opposite side, and you can kind of contrast your eyes and what you're looking at. So, and here's a young Douglas fir. Here's a young subalpine fir. You see how thin the bark is, and it, you know, this is dead. Okay, it shouldn't be dark color like this. And so the Douglas fir tends to have this pinkish bark. The inner bark, that is the sugar conducting tissue, is this right here, is pink. So a lot of times we'll peel in there and we'll see that pink and we'll go, oh, cool, it survived. But we want to go all the way down to the sapwood, and then it's this dark yellow. And so this heat damage on those trees will migrate around the tree in the sapwood. And even though the phloem tissue doesn't react as quickly, we got to look at that sapwood out there. All right, so let's move on to the next phase, which is the base of the tree. So here's a forest. This was actually the roaring lion fire in the Bitterroot. afterwards. And so these trees, you see the overstory is green foliage, you're going, yes, okay, these survived the fire. Not so quick, because there was a lot of fuel down here, especially these thick organic layers on the soil surface. So what we really want to look at is the base of these trees. And there's a real distinct difference between species. Again, larch and ponderosa pine. So this is a ponderosa pine. You can see how the stem goes straight down in the ground because they're taproot species. And the roots tend to go deep because they colonize hot, dry sites and they're looking for water. Douglas fir and the true firs come in afterwards. They grow in the shade, and what they're after is the nutrient-rich layer that's on the soil surface, so their roots tend to flare out. And those flares are what's really susceptible. So, for example, here's a Douglas fir right here, impacted by a surface fire. Okay, the crown is intact, it's green. We've got a little bit of scorch. So using our crown scorch methodology, yeah, it's going to survive. Okay, it's got 50% of its crown survived, green and grown well, but not so fast. We've got to look at the base. So the base of this tree is this right here. And you see how these shallow roots flare out in the soil, shallow soil. And they're right in that interface between that organic layer and the mineral soil. The mineral soil doesn't burn, but that organic layer does. And it doesn't burn with a big flame, it smolders like a big cigar. So it's long duration heat. That heat will be on that root system for hours. Okay, so we do the same methodology. We're looking for living tissue right under the bark. And if we look close at it, we peel the bark off. So you tell me, is that living or dead? Okay, it's proverbial toast. Okay, it's brown. The pitch is a wounding response. So there's living tissue right where that mineral soil starts. The heat didn't penetrate. So the root system is still alive. It doesn't know the rest of the tree is dead. It's trying to heal it over by pushing pitch on there as kind of a band-aid on there. But there's no way that that tree will survive. Now, it again depends. Here's a spruce tree. You see that root flare is even more pronounced on it. Okay? So a lot of it depends how much of that root system has been impacted by the heat. So, and we use the same kind of general guidelines as we do with the stem. If it's a ponderosa pine or a western larch, if half that root system has been disrupted by killing of the upper root system, it can survive. It's going to be at higher risk eventually from wind blow because the left side of the tree is going to destabilize. So if I get a wind coming at it from that side, there's nothing to anchor it and it might blow it over. So it is a higher risk tree. If it's a Douglas fir, it may survive initially 50%. It may survive 70%, but it'll be dead within 10 years. Okay? I've tracked a lot of Douglas fir that initially survived the fire, but they go into this slow death spiral. They just get weaker and weaker and weaker every year. Now, the advantage is that as long as that Douglas fir is alive, it can be producing viable seed. So you got to also think, what's coming next? Where's my seed source? Am I going to plant or am I going to rely on natural regeneration? So I have trees that I've assessed they're going to die. Like that previous Douglas fir, the crown is green, but the base is 60% girdled. Might not be bad to leave if you want natural regeneration from that tree because it's going to be producing seed in the meantime. And you have all this burned ground, which is a great seed bed for conifer seed. And so you can use that as a seed tree, knowing full well that in 5 to 10 years, that tree is going to be dead. Okay? The flip side on that is, okay, I'm going to salvage log my property. I have all these dead trees. I want them out of there. They're valuable. Okay? And I'm going to have to get a logger to come in and take them out. Okay? If I leave a tree like that that's iffy, the logger's not going to come back for 10 trees. Okay, so that's one of those decision points you got to think. Do I want to leave it, run the risk that maybe it'll survive, maybe it'll produce seed, but in 10 years I'll have to hire somebody, or I'll have to take my own chainsaw and I'll have to cut it down, turn it into firewood. I mean, that is a very viable option. But if you don't want to do that, if you're worried about that, then you might want to say, take them all and we'll replant. Okay, that nobody can make that decision for you. All right, so let's start looking at the bigger picture. Now we know what to evaluate on a tree, but tree size makes a difference. Okay? We often hear that older trees are the most fire resistant. Okay? And there is some truth to that. But actually, well, let's start with the younger trees. Real old trees are not fire resistant. It's the intermediate trees that are really healthy and big that are the most resistant. Young trees are very susceptible. So here we have a ponderosa pine that's 80% scorched, but it'll survive. It's a ponderosa pine. Okay, if it was a Douglas fir, questionable. Here one that's been 30% scorched. That's a no-brainer. Survive. All this regeneration under here, thin bark, little trees, they're in that heat zone, they're all dead. So the younger, the smaller the tree, the more likely it's affected by heat. Okay? The flip side is younger trees can take a lot more damage and survive. Okay, so if we, I've got my slides mixed up here a little bit, but so if we have a little tree right here and it has a little bit of green on it, and it has not been girdled by the heat, that little tree with 10% crown can fully recover because it's vigorous and it's growing. Whereas if we have an older tree, and this is where we get to old trees, are they truly fire resistant? So we started with this tree, is it going to survive or not? Well, using all those criteria, we might say, yeah, the stem tissue is alive, there's live buds on it, and it's going to leaf back out. And that's what we have. But it also depends, as I said earlier, on how much energy is stored in that tree. How many reserve carbohydrates are in that tree? How well is it doing? How much water does it have? So sometimes a tree will recover and turn into a nice big old tree. And other times, this tree, it took 7 years to die after the fire, but it died. Okay, it was on its way out because old trees actually are just in maintenance mode. They don't have the ability to regrow a lot of damage. So they might survive, but the old trees are more sensitive to fire, those real old ones, than their intermediate trees. So this tree right here, for example, that is a prime candidate that can take a lot of damage. It's still vigorously growing. It has a lot of reserve energy. And those are the ones that are most likely to recover. So the very young, the very old, it's very similar to human populations. They are the most susceptible to injury. And it's really the teenagers that you can't kill. Okay? So, again, so we look at this. This is Bridger Canyon. And we start to look at, okay, where are my best chances? Well, we look at these are actually some teenagers. They still have thin bark, but they have the greatest potential to recover. So we want to, again, look at the branches, the buds, the stem, the base. If that's all good, those are probably going to be the ones that do really well. Then we have these intermediate ones that they're mature trees, full crowns. They're still, have a lot of vigor to them. And then we have this real old one. I mean, 400-year-old Douglas fir. Flat top, you can't grow any taller. Start poor needle retention. This is probably a highly susceptible tree. So if I had to choose, I'd leave that one before I leave that one because that one just doesn't have the vigor and the energy that this middle-aged tree may have. So here's a slide I wanted to get to. So here's a different fire scenario, Douglas fir. This one, foliage is all gone. Alive or dead? It's dead, okay? The foliage is gone, it's dead, okay? But here we got the Douglas fir with a little top on there. And again, the base is the one place we really want to see. If the base is good, this one has a really good chance of surviving and a really good chance of developing into a nice, big, nice-looking tree. Because it's only half grown, and it adds trees. Conifers add trees by growing taller. Once the lower branches are killed off, they don't regrow lower branches. Some of them might have a little bit of sprouting that occurs, but those branches don't amount to a whole lot. Okay, they're not really an important part of the overall tree physiology. Okay, so again, this is one of those. More than likely, with that amount of heat on it, the base got girdled, but that's why it's really critical that you look at that base and see whether that survived or not. Okay? If it did, that tree has a real good chance. All right, so let's look at the final phase, the understory. Okay? So here's a ponderosa pine stand on a private landowner's property that I looked at many years ago. And I took this picture because you can see this detritus layer, dead needles. We call that duff. And that duff is about 3 inches thick right there. Okay, and back here we have grasses growing in the openings. Okay, so we had a bad fire go through here, and it was devastating to the landowner. This was his retirement. He had 20 acres. He was going to build a house here, live here. Fire went through. Whoop, let's go right. Whoop. I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. Just a demonstration. So when you have that litter duct layer, you have the needles on the top, and then the decomposing needles turn into this humus layer. It's organic. Okay, it will burn. And the thing is, a lot of the plant roots are in that humus layer because it has a great water holding capacity, and that's where all the nutrient exchange occurs. If that burns up, all the plant roots burn up with it. Okay, so if we go back to this scenario and we map out the fuel, if this burns, this area in the circle in the red has all that thick fuel on it, more than likely nothing's going to survive on it. Out here, where the grass is growing, you don't get that fuel accumulation. The grass roots are in the soil. The grasses will probably survive. The top will burn off, but the root system will stay alive. So, this very site, burned. Okay, same trees, and so we can assess the damage that's been here, and there's nothing there. Okay, but when we actually look at that soil surface, so this is a lightly burned soil surface. We can still see the needles, and if we dig down, that organic layer is still intact. If that's the case, that's low severity because the roots are there, a little bit of rain, and it'll start sprouting back vegetation. That's there. We don't want to disturb that. Okay, that's good to go. Alternatively, if that organic layer burns, we start seeing mineral soil through it. So you can see that. So these are scorched needles that fell down on here. But before that, the organic layer is gone. We're seeing mineral soil through there. Okay? And there are grasses in here. So we want to look carefully. So this is the grass, the bunch grasses that were there. They burned off. But the root system and what we call the meristematic tissue, or the root crown, right here is intact. Okay? And that will sprout back again, because there wasn't a lot of organic matter there to bake that. And here's the example. So after a little rain, and you're seeing this in the Bridgers already, okay? All that rangeland that burned is greening up again. Don't worry about it. It's going to come back thicker. All the nutrients tied up in that organic matter have been released by the fire, and the grasses are loving it. But you look back here, you don't see anything. Okay? Some other examples. So here in the openings, you see the green grass coming back on the hillsides. Very patchy, very little. So, and that has to deal with a dense forest canopy suppresses understory plant growth. There isn't a whole lot to start there, and all those needles form that needle mat that burns and imparts a lot of heat, killing the plants that are under there. Where you have a meadow, you don't have that needle mat, and the plant roots are in the mineral soil. The fire burns off the top, but the roots stay alive. Okay, so we always see this kind of patchiness. So this goes back to what was there before the fire is really important. So if you thinned your forest, where you create openings, not only do you reduce the risk of fire moving through the crowns, you actually increase the recovery rate, because when you thin it, you bolster and you promote a denser, better understory vegetation that recovers very quickly after the fire. Yes, sir?
Are you going to address what you would do to recover that area is in the forest?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the recovery is the next phase on this. Okay? The first part is figuring out how much damage do I have and where is it? Yes, sir?
So in that same example, it seems like in some of the lower areas, there are sections which are not very black, and there are sections that are very black, and those tend to be more associated with more densely packed trees that are completely burned. Are there sections that are more black because that duff burned, or why are they more black? And does that give you some indication as to whether the undergrowth will come back, or how do you think about that?
I'm glad you asked that question.
Can you summarize the question?
Okay, so fires burn in a mosaic, both in the overstory and in the understory. So the question was, So when I look at a burned areas, there's some areas where there's denser trees that are more black and other areas that are less black, okay? So there's different kinds of ash and it depends a lot on the fuel loading and the moisture that's there. So riparian areas have a lot of fuel, but they're wet, okay? So you'll see that surface fuels burn off, but because they're wet, the roots are in the moisture and the roots survive, and riparian areas recover very quickly with revegetation, okay? Swales, meadows, little openings. That previous picture, the valley bottom had all the green on it. It was wetter, and there wasn't a lot of fuel there. Okay, so when we look at a burn area, and this is actually a year after a fire, I took this picture. We have different colors of ash. We have black ash. We have white ash. Okay, white ash means there's a lot of fuel, a lot of heat, so that the organic matter was actually converted into its mineral component. White ash indicates the most heat and the most severe fire effects. Under white ash, there's going to be very little that survives. Okay? So you burn a big slash pile, you end up with a lot of white ash. Okay? Then next to it, we have black ash, or even here, even more black ash, and you can see this is where plants are resprouting in that. So black is not bad with regard to fire system. White ash is the worst because that's where the heat really was. Okay, but let's continue on. So you can have an understory fire situation. So the tops of these trees are all green. This is lodgepole pine in here, and there's a Douglas fir right up here. But you see all this white ash, and that's because there was an enormous fuel loading of logs, down woody debris. It burned very, very hot in there. So there is not going, even if there were plants in there, they did not survive. Because this is where you get soil baking. And the heat wants to go to the path of least resistance, so it's going to go up. But when you have this much fuel, it burns underneath, and the heat can't escape because you have fuel above it, so it penetrates in the soil, and so real deep soil penetration will go an inch into the mineral soil. Rarely will it go any deeper than that, just an inch. But that inch, that's where the plant roots are. Okay, so this is very, very severe. So white ash, severity to the understory vegetation. So, but we want to take a closer look. So before, on the lightly less severe, we saw needles that were there. Again, these yellow needles are needle drop from scorched trees after the fire. Okay, so you kind of have to see past those. You see I'm right in the mineral soil, and there's a thin layer of ash, but you're right on the mineral soil. Okay, so the ash is maybe a quarter to half an inch deep on that mineral soil. Okay, pine cones don't burn too well, so that's, you usually see remnants. They're not really an indicator of much. Now, where you had really high fuel loading, so the down woody debris that was 2 feet thick, or jackstraw dead trees that were waist high, you can get, in this case, the ash layer is 3 inches thick. And it's white. Okay? So there's nothing that survived in here, and now you have an additional problem because this ash is water loving. It absorbs all the water. But it gets saturated with water and it doesn't allow water through, so no water penetrates deeper into the soil. Okay? So it forms a seal on the mineral soil. And when this ash gets super saturated, it starts to ooze down the mountainside. And that causes severe erosion, plugs up channels, plugs up culverts. But it also isn't a good seed bed. It's very alkaline. Nothing likes to grow in that. You know you're in it when you start slipping and sliding because it's really greasy when you step on it. So, was there another question?
There was a question about how fire will affect leafy spurge.
Unfortunately, not real. Leafy spurge is such a deep-rooted species that the top will burn off, but the leafy spurge will come right back. Hound's tongue is negatively affected. I had that question today. It has big seeds, the seeds burn up. It has a tuberous root, but it's a biennial. So when the hound's tongue is seeding, it's going to die. Okay? And the younger hound's tongue in the rosette stage doesn't have that big root yet. So some species are killed by it, most of them are not. Noxious weeds like fire, unfortunately. Okay? Thistles come back thicker after fire than before.
And you mentioned cheatgrass.
Cheatgrass is a real problem because it's very invasive on burned areas. But we're doing the soil assessment. So to give you an idea, on a real severe burned area, this is 1 year after the fire, and this is thick ash on everything. Not a whole lot coming up, just to give you a visual that, you know, where you have that real severe ash, recovery is very, very slow. And to give you an example, we take a site like this, and I have many that I've tracked. So 5 years later, okay, and that ash forms these thick plates. If it doesn't erode off, it forms these thick plates that are colonized by fire moss, and it's a really bad germination bed. Nothing likes to germinate on it. And 20 years after this burned. So you know, so we've got aspen, so 20 years after this burn, it's starting to recover, but you still have a lot of these ashy plates, and when you get down and you look at it, that thick ash is still there. It's formed these impervious plates that are on there, okay? So, you know, this is natural cycle. The risk is this is highly erosive, okay? You get and in this previous example, that Laird Creek drainage, when that got hit by a thunderstorm that did one of these lots of rain all at once things, it washed 6 inches of soil off the top that ended down the valley bottom in people's backyards. It washed out several houses. Okay? So water damage on these heavy ash layers is a real risk, and usually it does more damage than the original fire did. So, and just as an example, so after the rain hits that ash, it turns into this kind of platy structure, and when it's, again, the ash, you hear a lot about hydrophobicity, okay? So water repellency of soils. That does occur, and that's supposedly organic waxes that are volatilized by the heat and they condense on the soil. I personally have seen very few places where that is. But almost everywhere, this ash that loves water forms this thick, gooey layer on top of the soil, and it doesn't let water through it. And then it becomes supersaturated, and it starts to move. And this is relatively flat ground. It gets a little steeper, and it really starts to move off. And when you have these drainages and watersheds, and unfortunately Bridger Canyon is one of those, you have a huge part of that watershed that got burned. So this stuff, these little basins, accumulate water and goo at the base of them, and they start washing out underneath them. And that's not the place to do the wattling, because the wall of water hits those straw wattles and it just washes them away. You need to stabilize the soils in the uplands so that the water stays there rather than running through the surface downwards. Okay? Yes, sir?
So you're saying move the erosion control higher up the hill, right at the bottom of the hill is just where everything comes.
Right. It's kind of like trying to mitigate a sprinkle versus a fire hose. So this is the fire hose scenario, and you can see, I mean, the whole point was to try and stabilize this stuff. And up here it works, but this is kind of sort of like the upland. There's not a whole lot of water coming off this little side slope, but that upper basin, it's not going to do anything right there. So you got to start stabilizing the upland areas to not have these effects. And the problem is, this stuff all moves. This was actually a culvert right here. And all this debris plugged the culvert. Water couldn't go through the culvert, so it went over the road and washed out the road. And so, you know, we see a lot of this on these kind of severely burned landscapes where you're seeing a lot of erosion, a lot of soil movement. And it's not good for up here because you're losing a lot of site productivity and potential for regrowth. But it's much worse for down here because that's where it all accumulates. And all the sediment plugs your culverts and your bridges. And then you have it going over the roads and into houses and things like that. Yes, sir. Ma'am.
Is there a preferred method of, addressing that up high? There's lots of choices.
So the question is there a preferred method for addressing it up high? And yes, and that is, we're going to get to that. Okay? Bear with me.
Hold that thought.
So, and I just wanted to throw this in here. This is Roaring Lion Creek, the spring after the fire. Okay? And this wasn't this is just normal snow melt. But you can see what it's doing. Okay? And this is very typical on a burned landscape. So, again, you got to, while you're assessing all your dead trees and all of this, realize that the next storm is not going to be fire, it's going to be water. So since these burn slopes are so highly erodible and relatively unstable if there is no vegetation. So again, if it's an opening where the grass is coming back, no need to worry. It's going to come back, the grass roots are there, they're stabilizing the site. It's under the dense forest patches that you have to be careful, okay? Because there's all the vegetation was killed because all that organic matter, all the heat, you're assessing, mapping that out, and that becomes unstable. So the point is you need to put barriers to slow the water down. Because the water will go through the ash. The more water you put on it, the pressure pushes it through the ash. But it takes time. And if the ash can move, it'll move. And so we do barriers, and this is a technique called contour felling. And you can't just drop a tree, because when you just drop a tree, only 10 or 15% of the tree is touching the ground. You have to delimit, and you actually have to get the log, berm it into the soil to create these barriers. So this is a good step. Now there's still a lot of erosion because that's not a lot of barriers for the surface area that's there. Okay? It's better than nothing. That's the first step. There are other techniques. So for example, this is a private landowner who got a hold of a lot of straw and put straw on the site. And it won't stop moving water, but it will retain water. So on upland sites, this works well. This doesn't work downslope in the drainage. If the water will move right through it. But this will keep the water on the site. The main thing is if you're going to do straw and put that out, make sure it's certified weed seed free. Because you might be introducing noxious weeds to a site that is perfect for noxious weeds to go ballistic on. They love disturbed sites. And in the first 2 years after fire, there's an abundance of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium on this site that the weeds are going to take advantage of. Now, you get the right plants on there, they will take advantage of it. There's a lot of questions come up about, okay, can I seed it with grasses? Okay? The problem is most grasses are perennials, so they will start germinating next spring. The biggest risk of erosion is from right now until next spring, when the snow melts. So you throw all that seed on the slope, before it can germinate and do anything, the erosion and the rainstorm has washed it all down the creek bottom. Okay? So it's still a good idea if you do it combined with other soil mitigation tactics. So another tactic is to use a cool season annual grass. In this case, winter wheat. Okay? Winter wheat won't persist on a site. It's just not genetic. It's so cultivated, it needs to be in a plowed field to do its thing. Okay? It germinates right away. So this is a slope that was seeded with winter wheat. And this is early the following summer, but it germinates right away, and it helps. By itself, does it work? No. Okay? Because again, it'll germinate, it'll get this tall. If it's on unstable soil, it'll still wash away with the soil. Okay? So, but the thing is, on these sites, nothing is going to grow there unless it blows in. So fireweed, which is a native, we want fireweed, but you don't always get it. More than likely, you're going to get thistles and cheatgrass and other things that you don't want on there. Okay? And that's where it is important to seed these areas with something that you want. Okay? So, the other tactic you can use is, again, ideally, on these unstable soils, we want a lot of barriers. And we want them pressed in the soil. Okay? So this is a site that was salvage logged. Okay? So dead trees, fire-killed trees, the wood is intact. The wood is valuable. Mills want it. They won't pay you as much because it's a lot more work. Loggers got to change the filters on the equipment all the time because the ash is plugging all that. It's expensive. It's dirty. Okay? Now I'm cutting down trees. I'd much rather cut down green trees than fire-killed trees. But the wood, once you cut a 2x4 from it, it's just as good as anything else. So if you can use salvage logging as a tactic, that's something you can use to stabilize these slopes. And so logging is just the practice of cutting down a tree and removing the wood. Okay? It can be good and it can be bad on the site depending on how it's done. So logging per se is neither good nor bad. It's how you do it. So in this case, the tree was felled, all the branches broke off of it, it was delimbed up there partially, and the equipment operating on it pressed it into close contact with the soil, and we saw zero erosion on it. And you don't want it too thick, because that woody debris can suppress native plant growth on there, or your grass seed if you want to. So you want the right amount on there to keep the water in sight. So this is like straw on steroids, okay? The fine straw blows away, or the water moves it. The water's not going to move this. This is interlocked matrix of twigs and branches. That was the result of salvage logging. And so to give you some examples, so here's some salvage logging where they're removing the whole tree, and they're skidding down the slope, and they always got, you can't skid side slope with that equipment, it'll tip over, okay? But this is where logging makes the situation worse, because now you've created these erosion channels on there, okay? So that as opposed to, we do this, where we're logging, but we're leaving or bringing back woody debris and putting it on the slope to stabilize that slope and slow down the water, okay? And especially where the trails go down, we want to make sure that those are really well protected with berms of woody debris and little water bars so the water is diverted off of them onto the sides. And, you know, it depends what kind of technique you use. This is called cut-to-length harvesting, where the trees are delimbed where they're dropped. There is no soil going to move through that. The problem is that sometimes this leaves too much organic matter on the site, where this in itself is going to inhibit plant growth and recovery on the site, and at some point may promote a high-intensity smoldering fire on there. So this is a good tactic, but I'd actually want to go back here and push some of this together because there's too much of it. So there is this balance of just the right amount of organic debris, not too much, not too little. All right, so let's go back to this scenario, okay? So what about, hey, it's nature, nature does its thing, it knows how to handle it, I'll just leave it alone. What's going to happen there? So this is, again, I've tracked the site, so to refresh your memory, that's what we started with. That's after the fire. That's 10 years later. Do nothing. Okay? It does recover, but the seed source was killed. Ponderosa pine cones do not withstand fire. There's only one tree species that can withstand a crown fire, and that's lodgepole pine. Okay? 10 years later, I come back now 20 years later, I don't have a picture of that. There's more trees on the ground, but it looks the same. And, you know, wherever there was a steeper slope, the erosion scoured it down to rock, and there's nothing growing on it. This is what fire does, okay? It can be good, it can be bad, it all depends on your objectives and how severe the fire was. So we really need to assess our property in context with the overall landscape. Okay, so here's a mosaic of fire on here. And when we look at it, so this is more open, this was dense timber, this was a riparian area, and this is where I talk a little bit about aspen and deciduous trees, Rocky Mountain maple. Cottonwood is a little more iffy. So they're very, very tall, easily killed by fire. Thin bark, leaves are easily burned off. Aspen, however, and I'm kind of kicking myself because I have a slide in the handout, a page specifically dedicated to aspen, and I forgot to put those in my slideshow, now that I'm thinking about it. Aspen actually is promoted by fire. Okay, aspen is typically a clonal organism, so you have a grove of aspen right here, so maybe there's 20 aspen. They are all interconnected with the roots. It's actually one organism usually, and it's root sucker, so it's a big clone. The top is burned off, it will come back 30% more than it was before. So where you had 10 trees that were killed by the fire, you'll have 100 root suckers come up. And they will extend as far as the root system went. And the root systems will go 30 feet past the crown line on there. And so aspen, don't worry about it. It will come back better than it was before. Keep the logging equipment away from it because that root system is very shallow. The last thing you want is a piece of equipment mucking up the root system under a burned aspen grove. And so I get asked, well, what about the standing dead aspen? Aspen wood decays very quickly. Within 3 to 5 years, all those will be laying down. Okay? And aspen wood is also very valuable for cavity nesting birds, chickadees and nuthatches, because it's soft wood, they excavate holes, they nest in it. So the best treatment for your aspen, Put a big line around it and leave it alone. And it will actually come better, with one exception. Burn landscape. What are the deer and the elk going to eat? They love all the new growth coming up. It's very nutritious, so the deer and elk from the whole county will be coming to this burned area. And you know what they like to eat the most? Your aspen shoots. Okay? So if you have a problem with deer and elk, you may have to fence off your aspen area to keep the deer and the elk out of it, because that's ice cream to them. All right, so if we do our assessment on here, open timber, mainly grass, good vegetation, we'll have good recovery. Dense timber, nothing survived in the understory, this is going to be the slow recovery site. So these are the ones that I worry about. This is where all the erosion is going to occur. This is where the noxious weeds are going to come in. This is where, in 5 years, you won't catch me in that, because all the stuff is unstable, and if it comes down and you're in there, you're in trouble. So, go back to recovery rates, okay? So if we go in that black patch, this is what we're going to see. And this was very severe. This was actually a tree that was dead before the fire. It was partially consumed by the fire. Live tree. And you can see the only place where we're seeing vegetation come back is where there was an opening. A little glade in there. And we can see that even on the open forest sites, under the tree where that needle layer was, all the grasses, everything was killed in that spot. Now, on a little spot like this, I'm not too worried, but this is where we're going to watch for weeds to start establishing. Okay? Now, let's expand that. So, here's a little grove of trees with more meadows and openings in between, a thin forest. You can see the recovery. The only things I need to worry about is right in here, and maybe I don't need to worry about it. If I don't have noxious weeds in the area, these will grow. First year, they'll produce abundant seed because all those nutrients in the soil, and they'll seed this area in. Don't need to worry about it. But I go on the slope, lip, same thing. Just to give you a different from the meadow looking in. And if I go on the slope behind here, that's all I have. Okay? So this is the area I need to treat. The other areas I can leave them be. Okay? So I'll give you a couple case studies here. Fridley Fire, which was up Trail Creek just south of here, burned 25,000 acres lodgepole pine. These unfortunate landowners had 3,000 acres of this timber that they grazed partially. They had some little meadows in there. This is what it looked like right after the fire. Question?
Question was, are there native seed options aside from, instead of winter wheat?
For annuals, no. And the problem is, native plants aren't good seed producers. Pine grass and elk's edge, I would love to seed in on burned areas. The problem is you can't get seed for it. It's so difficult to collect. It's expensive as all get out. So, grasses get pretty difficult. What do I seed in? On forested sites, orchard grass is something that will grow really well. The problem is orchard grass gets this tall. Do I really want vegetation this tall? If I'm going to graze it, orchard grass is great. If I'm not going to graze it, then I don't want to create another fuel hazard. So I want a shorter grass. So brome grass maybe, or crested wheatgrass, or slender wheatgrass. But the key is to work with your local conservation district, because they're keyed in on the grasses that are there and what's the availability of the seed. When we have a bad fire season, everybody's doing grass seed and you can't find it. So it's a good question, and unfortunately I have a really poor answer. It's going to depend on what you have available, how expensive it is, and what you want out of the site. So, excellent question. I like clover, Dutch white clover. It's an exotic. It only gets that tall. It's not the best for soil stabilizing. It's a nitrogen fixture. Wildlife loves it, but that's one of the reasons I like it. It germinates, it'll germinate as soon as it gets rain on it. It'll start stabilizing, putting some cover on the site. All the deer and the elk are going to eat it. It's not going to persist on the site, and that's going to allow the natives to move back in. So that's an option. If you use yellow clover is very aggressive. You'll never get rid of it once you have it. So think about real hard about what you're going to put on there and what your objectives are for your land.
So, can you repeat the name of that grass that you just mentioned, the one that you liked?
Orchard grass, Yeah, and there's different varieties of orchard grass. Orchard grass typically does not tolerate freezing without snowpack on it, which is why it's great. Most forested sites have a snowpack on them. But I urge you, check in with your NRCS office, your conservation district, see what grasses work. And here's the other thing is, they'll say, okay, or some people will say, let's do a mix. We're not sure what's going to work out here, so let's do some slender wheatgrass, and some orchard grass, and some mountain brome, and this. The key to good grass take is you have to have 40 seeds per square foot. Okay? So, not pounds per acre, because in a pound of Dutch white clover, I'll have 5,000 seeds. A pound of mountain brome, I'll have 100 seeds. Okay? So, figure out how many seeds there are to a pound, figure out how much area you have, and spread so you're going to get 40 seeds per square foot to get a good take, because there's stuff that's going to eat, animals are going to eat your seed as well. The bigger the seed, the more heavy the predation on it. So mountain brome is a native that's commonly used. It has a ginormous seed. It's expensive, so you're going to really pay a lot of money. Everything's going to eat the seed, and you're probably going to get really bad germination out there. So it sounds good, it just doesn't work well. And again, your local conservation people will have a better idea on this. And so if you go with a mix, I might end up with 3 seeds of this, and 5 seeds of that, and 10 seeds of that per square foot. And one of those works, so instead of having 40 seeds per acre, I got 40 seeds per square foot, I'll have 3 seeds per square foot. So mixes sound good, but it's really better to go with something you know is going to work, that's going to meet your objective, and stick with it.
Related question, are there any regulations? Do any other districts need to approve what you're applying?
You know, since this is broadcast who knows where and who's watching, it varies by state. It may vary by county. That's why you need to get your county conservation district or NRCS involved. They will know that. So the answer is yes and no. Depends where you are. Okay? And in a bad fire year, when seed is short, you might have some people saying, oh, I've got some seed here in the back. It's great stuff. You don't know where it came from. It might have come from China, and you're going to introduce some brand new exotic nasty stuff on the site. Make sure you know where it comes from and what's mixed in with it, because harvesting seed, there's always other stuff in there. It's just whether that other stuff is inconsequential or really a big problem. So in only seed your really severely impacted areas. Where you have natives coming in there, they will recover. If you use other techniques like getting the wood down on the ground, even straw, what came up is chipping wood, okay? So the idea is, okay, I'm going to run wood through a chipper and broadcast the wood chips out on the landscape, okay, as a soil stabilization technique. Wood chips float, okay? So you get all that water on there, they're going to move off the site. Plus, wood chips don't break down easily, okay? Decomposition occurs when you have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 30 to 1 at most. Wood chips are about 150 to 1. They don't decompose. And for fungi to decompose wood, they have to rob nitrogen out of the soil to break down the wood. This is why we put wood mulch down to suppress plant growth and weeds around our flower beds, okay? The only way if you're going to do wood chips is create a fake rotten log. So out in Montana, in this country, a big Doug fir stem falls over. In 200 years from now, it's broken down into this punky wood that's on the ground. Decomposition is very slow. There are organisms that use that. Salamanders, there's moisture in there. There's no nutrients in it, but there's moisture in that. We've done wood chip experiments on the Lubric experimental forest where we created wood chip piles about 2 feet tall, 2 feet wide, 20 feet long. It's a simulated rotten log. Within 3 years, it's full of fungi that are decomposing it. Within 10 years, it's just like an old rotten log. And it's enough wood chips that if water hits it, it's not going to flush it. This is upland site. Don't do this around the bottom where the water collects, because wood chips won't do anything. Okay? But broadcasting wood chips out on the landscape isn't going to do you anything except for rob your soils of nitrogen. So it's not something I would recommend. Unless if you make piles or strategic burns of wood chips, that can be helpful. Okay? So case study, lodgepole pine forest. Fire blew through this just like friendly fire, and there are parts of the Bridger Fire. There are parts of the Bridger Fire that look just like this, different people, but forest looks like that. They salvage logged it that winter, immediately. On these burn sites, the sooner you can get on them, the better. Okay? This is what it looked like the following spring. And they seeded slender wheatgrass on the site. Okay? They're cattle ranchers. They wanted grass, not weeds, out there, and there wasn't a whole lot. So this is following year, about start of July, after salvage logging. You see the woody debris on the sites and all of that. So a very little erosion on the slopes, but there's going to be a lot more water. So they had road blowouts because they had catch basins where the water now accumulated and it just flushed things out. Nothing you could do about that. Okay, you just don't have the vegetation there. But not bad. And to give you a little bit of a transition, so this is the ranch. It all burned. Okay, this is about a month after it burned. Okay, so 25,000 acres, it looked like that. These green patches, by the way, are little clear cuts they had put in that didn't burn, because that's a whole different topic, but these little regenerating trees don't burn as much. They're wetter. They have more moisture in them. Okay? That is the exact same view, a little skewed a little bit, so that meadow is right here. Okay, so we go back, so look at, if you focus on this, this is that little clear cut. Okay, that's right here. Same clear cut, okay? So they salvage logged it immediately after the fire. Next spring, this is what it looks like. They seeded in grass. Not bad, okay? The stuff that wasn't worth taking, they left standing. Okay, 3,000 acres of this, right? That is on the most heavily burned sites. This is what they left. This is the recovery the next spring. Okay, so pretty happy with that. The only problem is there was thistle seed in with their grass mix. And so this meadow, this whole thing, you can see some of it in there, is now 50% thistle, and you've got to do herbicide treatment on it. Okay, so weed seeds are really, really important on this.
So the issue was that they didn't ensure that their their seed was weed-free.
Well, they tried to,
Oh, really?
but again, they got a source that, unknown to them, had a lot of thistle in it.
So is there a problem with integrity in the wheat sellers, or the seed sellers?
Honestly, I don't know. That's not an area that I work in, and I'm not weaseling out of your question. It's honestly, I don't know. It's not an area I work in or do research in. And so there are weed specialists. Jane Mangold at MSU is our weed specialist. She could speak to that better than I could. Okay, so yes.
In the reseeding that this particular person did, they did a very wide broadcast seed.
Yeah.
In what you've seen in our fire area, is it viable to do like spot seeding?
Yes.
In areas that are...
Where you had these, in the Bridger Canyon fire, you had
Can you
more islands of
repeat the
trees.
question?
Okay, so in the Bridger Canyon fire, in this situation, they did a real broad landscape seed. Okay, they might have done it with an airplane, I don't know. Okay, in the Bridger Canyon, is it viable to do that, or is it viable just to treat small areas? And the answer is yes. So the Bridger Canyon, you had these little islands of trees, and where those burned, recovery is going to be very slow. So you can seed those little islands of trees. Again, don't waste your seed on areas where you're getting good regrowth. I mean, you have what you have, unless you want to change the composition of what's there. If you didn't like the grass, I mean, brome grass isn't really grazable real well. If you want to introduce something else, now's the time to do it. But normally, if you liked with what you had, it's going to come back better than before. Grass seed growers, a lot of range people would periodically burn their grassland because they get a better flush of grass fat. So, yes, sir.
Completely unfair question, but if you go back to the picture that you had before where you showed kind of a, nice green grass everywhere, if they would have done no seeding at all, do you have some sense of what that would look like a year later?
Well, it would still be green, but it would probably be 50% less green. This is a lodgepole pine forest that had grouse whortleberry, it's a type of huckleberry underneath, that's it. The huckleberry was about 80% killed. They're little islands and it's reseeding itself back in, but you didn't have a lot to start off with there. Plus you had about 1.5 inches of decomposing needle detritus. This lodgepole pine forest was about 100 some years old. And if you've been in lodgepole pine, you get an understory, but it's not heavy to grass. Grass likes a lot of sunlight. So it was forbs and grouse whortleberry, and those didn't survive the fire real well. So again, we go to this. You look at down here, there's not a lot there, and this has probably not been seeded. So where over here, they got a better seed mix on it. Okay, and I'll give you a few more examples here because, as I said before, every fire is different. It interacts with the ecosystem different, and in the Rocky Mountains, I can walk 100 yards and I will cross 3 different unique plant communities and processes that go on there. So it's very site-specific what you do. And I'm showing you these generalities. And generalities are a lot like multitasking, the definition of which is doing everything equally poorly. Okay? So it's really important for you to go out, and I'm trying to give you these tools to look at, okay, what am I going to do here? What am I going to do there? I might do something different over there. Okay? It's really important to do that. Because the beauty of these is they are so diverse. That's why we have all this wildlife. Because most wildlife doesn't just like one thing. It likes a combination of things. And as I've told other landowners, they've got a generic prescription. Okay, you need to replant your trees 8-foot spacing per acre. You got 160 acres, so you need to order 10,000 seedlings, plant them 8 feet apart. I said, well, that's like starting a painting, taking a paintbrush this wide, and just going bloop, 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 okay? These are unique sites. The soils vary, the hydrology varies, the plant communities vary, so it's a painting. And with this fire, you have a chance to repaint it. I mean, nature is going to dictate how well your colors work, but you have the chance to do it the way that works best for your objectives as a landowner to fit it in with the processes that you see here. This is a place to plant aspen in if you want to try and get aspen back. Okay? If you're low enough elevation and it was all dug fir, maybe you want to plant some ponderosa pine in here. Ponderosa pine will grow fine in the lower elevations in Bridger Canyon. It's not there because past fires wiped it out. So, it's just, there is no right answer. There's a whole lot of possibilities. Yes?
Is it actually advantageous then to be diverse because climate's changing and we don't know what's happening?
Oh gosh, that is about as loaded a question as you can get. Climate change is a complex topic, okay? And how the climate change could bring drier summers, it could bring wetter summers, okay? What it's gonna do is add more variability to the climate. We're gonna see more extremes and less predictability. These ecosystems in northern Montana have been here for 13,000 years. This is the time of the Holocene. Prior to that, our tree species have been around for 250 million years. Okay? So the native trees and the plants we have here have this enormous genetic variability. They are perfectly adapted to handle these climate changes because we've been there before. The first 8,000 years of the Holocene was warmer than it has been. Okay, and here's what we have. We have it because it survived all of these. The medieval optimum, where we had 500 years of abnormally super hot, warm, dry weather, where most of these forests didn't exist. It was grassland. Dr. Kathy Whitlock's research here out of MSU lake core sediments show how much these plant communities have changed over time. So what we have has the resilience to handle climate change. So I personally prefer to work with what we have. So, sorry for the long one, but it's a good question, and it gets answered too simplistically too often. I'm very much opposed to taking trees from Utah and planting them in Montana, okay? Because Montana trees have the genetic depth to handle the climate change that we're going to see. That's my opinion. Climate change, there's a lot of opinions on it.
So a ponderosa might be sort of useful Montana-based diversity, but you don't want to go down and get
all seedlings, you want to match the elevation.
Yep.
So you want ponderosa, so this is eastern Montana, get eastern ponderosa pine that is matched to the elevation of Bridger Canyon. So, all right, let's go through here, because again, we can spend days on these topics. So I just wanted to give you an idea. So this is 1 year after the fire, salvage log, and I want to make the point. So there's a lot of literature out there that says salvage logging is awful. It adds damage to the system. If I were to wait a year, say, well, I'm not sure I want to do it, I'll wait a year, and I go in here and salvage log it now, I'm going to cause more harm than I do good, because we're getting all of this regrowth on here, the soils are being stabilized, and now I'm going to go muck around with equipment in there. That's why immediately after the fire is the time to salvage log. The damage has been done. You're not going to add to the damage to the site. It's been done. And you can add, let me correct, you can add if you're creating ruts that go up and down the hill. Okay, then you're going to funnel water and real erosion and all of that. But if you do it right and you use a salvage log to place your woody debris while you're getting your logs out, it's all ash, the benefits vastly outweigh the potential negatives, in my opinion. Okay? And that's based on, I have tracked numerous salvage log versus not salvage log sites. And make my point, so this is 1 year after the fire. This is 13 years after the fire. Same site. That's all natural lodgepole pine regeneration. So lodgepole pine is the only species that has serotinous cones. The seeds are protected in those cones from the fire. So when a crown fire goes through, it kills the seeds from every other tree and kills every other tree. It kills all the mature lodgepole pine, but the seed survives. And that's the beauty of lodgepole pine. That's why the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is heavy to lodgepole pine, because these fires do this and have been doing this for a long time. The problem is, where this used to be a mixture of subalpine fir and spruce and Douglas fir and lodgepole pine, now it's pure lodgepole pine. Except where this gentleman had done some clear cuts that didn't burn, where you have a seed source of subalpine fir, Douglas fir, and spruce in there. And those are now your genetic resource that is going to introduce those species on the landscape. And that's where I make my pitch for management. Appropriate management enhances the resilience of an ecosystem by creating these pockets that can survive these different stresses. So,
Another, on that follow-on on that topic, you talked earlier about maybe leaving some trees that were viable and had seeds.
right.
Is there any rule of thumb or guideline on how far apart, how many per area?
Excellent question. So the question is, if you leave trees as seed source, how far an area will they seed in? It depends on the species. Ponderosa pine has heavy seeds, so you can expect ponderosa pine to seed away from the tree maybe 50 yards. That's all. It moves very slowly. Douglas fir has lighter seeds that get blown by the wind a little bit. So 200 yards for Douglas fir. Spruce, very small seeds, but like certain microsites, spruce can go half a mile. Okay? Subalpine fir, somewhere between Douglas fir and spruce. The best one is western larch, which you don't have here. But if you have a larch seeds will fly 2 miles. Okay? And that's larch's adaptation is to survive these kinds of fires and then seed in the whole landscape. It's one of the, in my opinion, the most fire-adapted species, next to lodgepole pine. Different strategies, though. Okay? So, so to do nothing. So what if I would have done nothing here? Let's walk across the boundary line from this property. That's a do-nothing scenario 13 years later. Okay? Now, I'm not saying this is bad. If you're lynx and you're looking for a denning site, you need this. Okay? So, but you have to decide, do I want this? If I do, how much and where do I want it? So, I'm not by any means saying salvage log everything. Do it where it works and does multiple purpose. Okay? Don't do it where it doesn't work. And you're going to get this, but these systems have been doing this for at least 13,000 years. The future risk of severe fire is very high in there because of the fuel loading. It's part of the matrix of decision making. Just give you another example. So this is a really severe fire. This is lodgepole pine, subalpine fir that burned. This is 1 year after the fire. This is where I took that picture of the thick ash and where I showed you the recovery rates. This is the same site. 5 years after the fire. Okay? The more severe fire, the slower the recovery rate. Okay? So at this point, I wouldn't want to go in here and try and salvage log. One, the wood is worthless, but now I'm going to injure all this regrowth that's occurring. Dryer site, do nothing alternative. This is a Douglas fir. This is analogous to Bridger. If you do nothing, okay, 10 years from now, that's what it's going to look like. Neither good nor bad. It's, do you want this on your site? And you can see there's been some erosion. I mean, this is part of Lyric Brick, actually. And the erosion off these slopes was phenomenal. Okay, so, and again, riparian areas, aspen, they will come back really well because almost all of your broadleaf choke cherries, Rocky Mountain maple, aspen, serviceberry, they will all resprout back very prolifically. Don't mess with them. If anything, protect them from the deer and elk, because the deer and elk are going to be attracted to that. Okay? So, any questions about this? Yes, sir.
So if you would have taken this exact same site and did the seeding that you described prior, will that encourage, I mean, obviously it encourages stabilization and growth faster, but will it also encourage better growth? Like, would this have been dramatically different than this 10 years hence if you'd have seeded this, or what would it look like?
I actually have pictures, and I haven't included it into this, of sites where we had to do nothing right next to where it was salvage logged, seeded, and planted to trees. The difference would be if I draw a line down this drainage, and here I do that work and here I don't, I would now have 6-foot tall trees, 6-foot tall forest here. Okay, and I have it on my laptop. I can dig it up and show it to you. This is on the Sula State Forest, where the Sula was 7,000 acres. The state made $15 million salvage logging that. State land is school trust fund land. They did everything. We worked together on that. They did everything right. Some of these pictures I showed you of the logging, the residue that are from that site. After 3 years, it was really poor tree regeneration, so they planted it to ponderosa pine. We got it where there were some Doug fir that survived. There's a lot of Doug fir seedlings, 200 yards out from there. And joining that was Forest Service that said, okay, the Sula's doing all this stuff, we're going to let nature take its course. That's what the Forest Service looks like. Okay, the Sula State Forest is now a forest with 5 to 8-foot tall trees in it. And they did seeding grass because the leasee who leased that to graze his cows on said, hey, there's nothing there for my cows to eat. The NRC said, okay, seed, what grasses you want to seed in there? You buy the seed, we'll seed it in there. They put slender wheatgrass on there. It's pretty well populated with grasses. Yeah, there's some noxious weeds, but now you got to spot spray your noxious weeds. And the thing with noxious weeds is, if they're new, you got to spot them the first year and hit them before they produce seed. Once they produce the seed, like knapweed, that seed's viable for 15 years. So then you're going to be committed to 15 years to going back and treating that spot over and over and over again. So everything has to happen this first year to have the best results, in my opinion. You need to stabilize those slopes. You've got to assess your trees, map out your severity, figure out where your biggest problem areas are, treat those, slow the water down, help in the revegetation, maybe plant, but plant to what you want, okay? So 8-foot spacing is 640 trees per acre, 12-foot spacing is 320 trees per acre, okay? Maybe you want a dense pocket here and an open pocket there. This goes back to you painting a picture. Don't think about this as a wheat field. I'm not going to plant every tree at this spacing. So here I've got this, wet area, this north slope. I want to plant heavy Doug fir. This south baked slope, I'm going to plant sparsely ponderosa pine. Okay? You're recreating a forest ecosystem. Think about what uses it, how you want to use it. You might want to leave a meadow in there. Okay? Just because something used to be there doesn't mean it has to be there. Because that's the way nature works. Whatever is there is because some seeds happened to land there a long time ago. So, yes, sir.
When you're evaluating your areas that need to be reseeded, how important is it when you reseed that you get through that ash layer to where you get seed soil contact? Do you need to get into that mineral soil? I mean, if you just broadcast and you still have an ash layer of 2 or 3 inches, I imagine your germination rate is
So
going to be...
to rephrase, paraphrase your question. So when you're reseeding grasses or other preferred seed on there, do you need to do some kind of soil preparation because you have that ash layer on there? And the answer is, if you do, you will get better germination. So Hal Harper, who used to be NRCS soil specialist and did a lifetime of grass seeding research, shared all of his notes and his research with me. And he said, if you're not going to do anything, you need 80 seeds per square foot. If you're going to do something, you go down to half of that. Okay? And again, yeah, you throw it on the ash, and then you get rainfall on that ash, it's all going to erode down, your seed's going to all end up down the creek bottom. Okay? And so again, that ash layer is loaded with macronutrients, mainly phosphorus and potassium, and a little bit of nitrogen in there as well. You want to keep that on the site. But that layer on top of the soil is kind of a problem because it prevents water from going in, and it's a terrible seed bed. Okay, it's alkaline and the seed's exposed. So if you can break that up, I mean, ideally, yeah, get a rake out there, but you know, I wouldn't want to rake 20 acres, you know, let alone 100 acres. So this is, again, if you are going to be doing any kind of work out there, anything you can do to break it up but not move it off site. We want to keep it on the site, but we want to break up that contiguous crust that's there. And you know, if you can have a four-wheeler and you can drag an old harrow behind it, that's beneficial. Okay? You can't do that after you put the wood down. So if you want to break that up now, and so there's pros and cons. If I do that, I'm going to loosen it up. The rain hits it, it's more likely to erode rather than having a thick plate on there. But if I just leave the thick plate and I throw seed on it, my seed's not going to take. So we're balancing a potential bad with another potential bad. The question is which one is worse and which one is going to give me the desired results. So ideally, I would break up the ash, I would throw my grass seed down, then I would log it, and I'd have the woody debris in place to hold everything in place. That's my ideal scenario. And from the case studies that I have tracked, that has worked incredibly well. If you leave it alone, and we get mild rain, and we don't get a heavy snowpack melt, it'll come back really nice. On the other hand, if we get a cloudburst on that, all of that organic layer, that's the result of the last 10,000 years of vegetation on there, is going to end up in the creek bottom, which is going to end up in the reservoir or your drinking water supply. That's the worst case scenario. So we have to balance consequences with the options that we have, and there is no absolute right, and there is no absolute wrong. There's just, if we do this, here are my risks. If I do that, here are my risks. So, and that's, I mean, seems like I'm waffling a little bit here. This is complicated, and you know, you never know what next week is going to bring. Question.
You talked about timing of grass and logging. What about planting replacement trees, timing-wise?
Spring planting, this first year, plant your trees, because remember that nutrient load that's there. Those seedlings you put in the ground are going to take advantage of that and grow like crazy.
For spring, though.
You plant in the fall, there's nothing out there. Along come the deer and the elk. Oh, what's that green thing in the ground? Okay, so deer and elk predation on planted seedlings can be enormous. So, you know, in forestry, sometimes they put plastic mesh over them. You got 10,000 seedlings out there, put plastic mesh on them, and then you got to take it off, or for the next 20 years, you're going to see bits and pieces of plastic mesh all over the landscape, okay? You can spray them with a repellent like plant skid, powdered pig's blood, okay? But that's an expense, and again, to treat all that stuff. So plant in the spring, and the Seedling Nursery State Conservation Nursery right now has a full inventory. I mean, they produce it at cost. The state nursery is not government subsidized. They operate off of the sales of their seedlings. It's for conservation purposes, and they do it at cost for you. So you pay $1 a seedling, okay? And you'll get a quality seedling, so there's containerized and bare root. Containerized generally do better, but the deer and the elk like them more. They're juicier and more tasty, whatever. But if you plant in the spring, the grass is coming up, the elk and the deer are gonna go elsewhere, okay? And that's when the moisture's in the ground, you still have that pulse of nutrients, and those seedlings are gonna just love it. You wait 3 years, now you have grasses and everything else in there, those little seedlings are gonna have to compete for soil water against all that, and you're gonna get a lot of mortality in it. So everything has to happen this year for the optimal results. Another question.
From online, what's the steepest slope you would propose salvage logging if trees can be removed from below without new mid-slope roads?
Well, the steepest slope is the one that the loggers are comfortable operating on. Okay, so for real steep slope, they use what's called line skidding. For that, they need a road up above there. It's complicated, it's expensive, okay? And there aren't many line skidders left in Montana, so you might not get somebody. So they're gonna be used mechanical harvesting, so a hot saw or cut to length, it's all tracked equipment. It's low impact as it can get. So the logging machinery has lower pound per square inch pressure on the soil than a farm tractor does, okay? It's designed to do that. And the logger is gonna look at that and say, I can do that or I can't. And so on some areas, they can go up to 60%, you know, which is almost a 30-degree slope. But they got to know what they're doing because they can tip over equipment. So it's really going to be, you got to get the forester, and in Bridger Canyon, RY is the closest sawmill in Livingston. They use all this stuff. They have crews operating here. So this isn't to promote one industry over the other. They're just here. Okay, and so you really got to get a forester from them. Dennis DeVos is one of the foresters there. Get them out, have them look at what you have. So, I mean, RY had 2 mills, one in Townsend, one in Livingston. They had to shut down the one in Townsend because they couldn't get enough logs to keep it open. So, you know, you got to work with whoever is willing to buy it. You might have some local people that want to do it, but to treat the magnitude of the area you have. And so you have 10 acres, and the logging equipment is 50 miles away. It's going to take them 2 days to get it all there and set up. That's all cost. Okay? Where if they're half a mile away working on your neighbors, they can be there the next day and do it. So what they try to do is they try to line up. The more of you that get on board with this, the more viable it will be for you. And some of you, it might be, well, I can get it, but it's not going to make you any money. I can do it at cost. That might be an option. I mean, how much volume do you have? Because modern harvester costs $500,000. They got to pay that thing off by logs delivered to the mill. So it's, again, I'm just trying to give you an idea of the variables that are in here because there is no set answer to your question. So, but you do have a mill here that is willing to buy this stuff if it will work in their mill. If it's a limmy Douglas fir that's 30 feet tall with branches this big, they can't use that. You can't cut 2x4s and 2x6s from it. But there's a lot of nice Douglas fir that is black out there. It's really nice stuff and make really nice wood products. If you got 4 of those trees, it's not worth it for them to come and get it. So people ask, what's the minimum acreage? Anywhere from 5 to 20 acres. If it's 5 acres next to someone else's, then we'll say, yeah, I'll come get it. If it's 5 acres, half a mile from someone else, maybe not. But that's not my call. I mean, I am not in the inner workings of RY's mill. I don't know what they do. Or Sun Mountain is up in Deer Lodge. They're within trucking distance as well. So, you know, those are the 2 that probably would be the most interested in the Douglas fir. Other questions?
Got a big one here.
Okay.
Starts off, love you, Peter. Tony Hartshorn here.
Tony is our soil scientist, resident soil scientist at Montana State University.
And I'll take my mask off for a second so it's clear. With all due respect, I fear there's a greater risk than sediment delivery to drinking water sources. From my angle, much of the Bridger Foothills Fire burn scars is vulnerable to very large debris flows. They could easily shoot down the 4 burned drainages, Mayfield, Place Creek, Beasley, Pine Creek. obliterating everything in those bedrock bottom channels. This all came home to roost for me when I traded emails with Stuart Jennings, and he pointed out the size of landslides mapped just north under Bridger Bowl. Just because the slopes are locked and loaded doesn't mean they'll fail, but if that cloudburst trigger you mentioned comes along and ends up focused on some of the steep and coarse-grained geological units, there could be a lot of mass wasting.
Yep.
Thanks for this wonderfully detailed assessment of potential futures for this burned area. We're overdue for a beer.
Great. I agree 100% with Tony. It's this ash and organic matter, and it's a cumulative effect. So if you get half an inch across 7,000 acres, okay, as it concentrates down the bottom and gets narrower and narrower, you're going from half an inch to 20 feet of water. Okay, has a lot of energy, there's a lot of woody debris, there's a lot of fine stuff out there. It's the fines that are going to move first. Once you get all that water moving, then you're going to have bigger stuff move too. But that's why treating upland sites where the water comes down first and keeping the water on the site slows down the rapidity of its accumulation downstream. And so, yeah, I'm very worried about the lower end. I'm not a hydrologist, so Tony, with all due respect, I'm avoiding that because it's not my area of expertise. But I've seen it over and over again, and that's why I did show those pictures of what my concern is. And stabilizing those slopes, it's not a silver bullet. If you get a worst case scenario, everything you do is not going to work. So, but you're upping, if you do nothing, your odds are 50-50. If you do something, you might bring those odds down to maybe 20% or 10%. Okay? That's, as land managers, that's all we can do, is we can change the odds in our favor. There are no absolutes in all of this.
So in those areas, so from a realistic standpoint, you have areas up there that are not timbered.
Mm-hmm.
They're more just grass, steepier sloped. Because it's not really conducive to planting this or to reseeding, you know, you won't see the benefit of reseeding right now as far as erosion. You know, erosion's going to take place this fall and winter, you know. So in those areas, upland, what are your realistic options that these people, I mean, if they have 5, 7, 8 acres on steep slopes, you know, you can't salvage log if there's not those materials. I mean, we talked about straw. What else is there out there to do this?
Well, I was hoping NRCS would be here because they often have some emergency money.
Actually, we have Chris on the line,
Okay,
but
so-
we don't have a big speaker, so.
Okay, so I would talk to NRCS. They may have some cost share money that will allow a landowner to hire crews to do contour felling, to do this kind of work by hand. I mean, I met with a landowner today who has a small drainage behind their house, and it drains directly into the back of their house. I have pictures of similar scenarios where that house ended up with 3 feet of sediment up against the back of their wall. So they're looking at, okay, I need to build a drainage ditch off of here, and I need to stabilize the slope, and I need to slow the water down. And so all the stuff we talked about with them, and they're going to get to work on it, and they probably don't have enough to make it worthwhile salvage logging. So he's going to have to buy a couple chainsaws and get to work, or hire someone to do it. I mean, there are companies, you know, some contractors that would be involved in doing this. But again, if you're on a site that is already an unstable slope, and all this burned area above you, over which you have no control, is now going to collect all this water, and that supersaturates that slope, you may get some mass wasting going on there. And that's very analogous. Very good friends of mine, some land up Bridger, they have spent the last 15 years thinning their forest, doing everything perfectly to make it fire resistant. Fire got blown in the canyon and blew up the canyon, and only a concrete bunker would have survived it. They lost their house, they lost almost all their trees. You know, no matter what you do, sometimes that worst case scenario comes along. You got to realize that, you know, we're living in a natural landscape and stuff happens. Okay? But again, if we do these things, we can help change the odds in our favor. And so rangeland that's burned, like I said, I've been up there across a lot of it, the grass is coming back very nicely. Okay, I'm not worried at all about those rangelands. The only thing I'm worried about is if you had cheatgrass or knapweed or leafy spurge up in there, that's going to gain an advantage. Some plots I put in the southern Bitterroot after the 2000 fires, by year 3, where knapweed existed, it expanded its range 3 times. And the density was 3 times more. I call it the rule of thirds. So I got 3 times as many plants where it existed, and it expanded into 30% more of the areas where it wasn't before. Now, I just had a graduate student remeasuring that 20 years later. Most of it's gone. The native vegetation has actually pushed it back out. But the 3-year results were horrible. I got out there and go, oh my God, this has become knapweed heaven. So on those burned areas, if I got rangeland next spring, get out there, walk it frequently. Look for purple flowers. Look for thistles. And if you can jump on those, whether you remove them mechanically or you use herbicides, get on them. Biocontrols are not eradication tools. So this is one of those cases where I say biocontrols are not your best option. They're a good option if you have a chronic problem. But if you have an invasion of a patch here and a patch there, it's either dig them out or use the appropriate herbicide to kill them before they produce a seed. So there's a lot to do. Yes?
So I have fire brain. I only take in about 50% of what you tell me. You talk about contour, what was the terminology again?
Contour felling.
Felling, okay. If we were talking with logging companies and want to describe what we would like done, is there anything else beyond saying you want contour felling?
It's in your handout. Show them the handout. Okay? And if there's I work with the Montana Logging Association. I do a lot of training with the Montana Logging Association, okay? If you want to use me, please do. Tell them, okay, Peter Kolb said I should do this. I don't mind if they call me up and they cuss me out, okay? That's part of my job. Because again, I'm very respectful that they have to earn a living. And they got to make it work for them. And the more you ask them to do, the less money they make. Because it's how many trees, logs per hour can I get off of this? That's the reality of the world, okay? Just like car production. So, but they know what they need to do. It's whether they can do it. And if they have questions, say, give Peter Kolb a call. I do trainings with them all the time. I'll come down here and work with them. And I'm perfectly happy if they tell me, Peter, you're full of beans. This is nonsense. I can't do this. But again, I have 30 years of case studies and other work that shows what, if you do these, the outcomes are much better for getting a forest back or getting native plants back. Okay, that's mainly what I'm looking at. If you want to turn it into a parking lot, then that's not what you want to do. But if you want to restore this to a functional wildlife habitat and forest and rangeland, these steps can be helpful. They all take time, they all take work, and they all cost money. And so the beauty with salvage logging is that's the only thing that's actually going to pay you to perhaps do something on your land. If you have the volume and the stems and the access, and that's why I can't speak for any company that's out here. You got to get one of their foresters out there. But I can say, here's the guidelines that you should follow. And you're the landowner. If you don't like what the options are, don't salvage log it. But you got to explore all of those types of things. And I'm never 100% right. I'm always insecure because you make these recommendations, and I know that they work 80% of the time. And if it's in one of those 20% of the times, it's like, what did we miss? Why didn't this work? It does happen that way. But again, we're trying to stack the odds in our favor on all of this. And so I really don't want to tell you what you should do. Here are your options. It's your choice. It's your land. You've worked hard for it.
So so a lot of that land that burned is privately owned.
Mhm.
And from your experience, well, what you described seems better if more people do it, right? If people above you do things that will help erosion and help
Right.
you out, et cetera. From your experience, what percentage of people in a place like Bridger Canyon will do what you described? 5%, 50%, 80%?
I have no idea.
Do you have a guess based on past experience?
Well, everybody is approaching this with their own paradigms and their own visions on things, and we get all of this information coming at us from different sources and different, all I can say is I'm not getting paid by anybody other than the state to take the science that we know about, and I don't like to use the term science, the research that has been vetted and proven, plus my experience and work in this arena, and here are your options. There are landowners where they live in that house 3 weeks out of the year. There are other landowners that live there year-round and have their life's work in that. Okay, so honestly, I don't know. I know some of the folks up there; they're all great people, but I don't know everybody. I don't know the majority of them, and I cannot speak to what their sentiment is.
I was just curious, based on similar scenarios you've seen other places.
Well, most landowners, landowners tend to be show-me people. Okay, they're distrustful. I'm a landowner, I'm distrustful. Someone tells me, you ought to do this. Yeah, get off my property, it's mine, okay? But when I see something I like, I go, wow, can I do that? So I usually find that when a couple landowners do something and it works out, other landowners come on board and say, yeah, I want to do that too. The problem with this is you have a year. So there are going to be some landowners 5 years from now that may go, oh, I wish I would have done that. There might be some landowners that have said, damn that Peter Kolb, I did what he said I should do and I wish I wouldn't have. Okay? And that's why I'm not telling you to do anything. Here is what I have experienced. Here's what I've measured. Here's what I've studied. These have been the outcomes based on that. So how's that for totally non-committal?
It's a decent answer.
I'm Chris Mahony with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I have Avery Hackett, our area forester, with me tonight. And I just wanted to touch base. Some of this information is going to be similar or the same from last night's. I just wanted to touch base and go over a few items here. So folks who don't know, the NRCS, we work with private landowners. It's all voluntary. We're a non-regulatory agency, and we're able to provide some cost share related to some practices. So we do cost share on tree thinning, tree stand improvement, that sort of thing. I can provide definitely more information as needed. So that for our cost share programs, there are some eligibility issues. So your adjusted gross income has to be less than $900,000 a year. You have to have a farm number, and that's easily accomplished. You just need to touch base with the Farm Service Agency. Their number is up on the screen at 522-4000 extension 2. And essentially they'll draw a line around your property and you will be able to get a farm number. At that point, you'll be eligible for our program as long as we have a program in your specific area. And we do have a program for the Bridger bangtails to remove fuel loading and to address forest health. So I went over this other stuff here, the analysis on private land. So this is our first step, is to determine any immediate concerns related to public safety and risk to property. We do have a program to address that if we find some serious issues. So it's related to culverts, roads, mass wasting, that sort of thing. We were out with our engineer last week. We looked at a number of sites. We're going to be going back out a number of times. I've actually, since that, have been on a number of site visits where I'd like to bring some folks out to take a better look and see if there's going to be a potential for some mass wasting, mud flow type issues. Our second thing is to address soil erosion, weed infestation. I think Peter had it just right. We don't want to waste seed on stuff that's going to come back. We want to focus in on those areas that burned a little hotter, where the remaining grass might not survive. And I would highly recommend just doing annual seed. Like Peter had mentioned, I think winter wheat's a great option. Oats, barley, even some annual ryegrass. Make sure it's annual. I am going to present you a seed mix that our range specialist produced. We have a native mix and a mix that has some introduced. And we can work with you on specifically tailoring a seed mix to your site, because typically different soils will promote different grasses to live. So you want to tailor it to your individual situation. But we do have something in general. And then we also want to address this fuel loading in forest health. So we do have a current program with our Bridger Bangtail Forest Health Hazardous Fuels Reduction TIP. And TIP is just short for our Targeted Implementation Plan. And I'll put up a slide here in a moment to show that. So then a lot of folks are interested in resources. So I would touch base on, and I'm going to increase this size so folks could actually see it. So that's our website. Underneath that, there's all these different links you can click. So after the fire, hand raking, what they were just talking about, getting the seed to the mineral soil. You don't want to go crazy on that, but you might want to do a little raking in areas you're going to reseed. Removing hazard trees, all these things, there's a bunch of good information, and we can provide more information if necessary. Then in addition to that, the Farm Service Agency does have some programs available for folks who lost fences, livestock, watering systems, or even if they have a whole bunch of debris that they need to remove. So I would touch base with those folks. They are in the same building we are, which is out on Huffine Lane in the Forest Service building. So NRCS and FSA, we're on the south end of the building, just as a quick heads up. But we're more than willing, it's kind of our job, our mission to help people, help the land. So please give a call. I'll come out and I'll do a site visit and just give you my impression on things you can do on your property, potentially being able to provide some cost share for some of this. So I should mention all our cost share programs are generally competitive. So what we do is we take applications all through the year, and in the fall we batch those, we rank them based on their conservation value, and then you know pretty early spring who's going to get funded and who's not. One thing to note, to participate in our program, you cannot start a practice before it's contracted. So if we are going to contract seeding, reseeding, it would all be perennial type of seeding, but you wouldn't be able to seed stuff now and using perennial seed, enter our program, and then get paid for something you had already done. So I just wanted to make that clear. In addition, I have some other information here. So I'm going to just show this real quick, and we can provide this to folks. So this was this fire severity map. And as you can see, most of the area was low severity. There is some higher severity in the middle, on some steeper slopes that just had trees. And like Peter said, on some of those slopes where you just had trees and those trees had shaded out most of the grass understory or the shrub understory, there's nothing left there to even come back. So I would highly recommend keeping an eye out on those steeper slopes that had a lot of trees. Those might be prime candidates for reseeding. And I have some slides here. These were taken this is a slide from the Roundup fire. So the slide on the left here, and hopefully you can see this, they did reseed it, and they did it using helicopters in this situation. But this was a site they did not seed on the same fire. And you can obviously see the difference. And I believe this was only a year or two out. So things have probably changed quite a bit after that. I just wanted to put that up as a graphic for folks to see. This is a slide of our current program right now. So the Bridger Bankdale's hazardous fuels reduction. I'm gonna go to the end to show you the area that's eligible. So anything within this pink line is eligible for this program. So essentially we got Flathead Pass to the north, over to Park County, down to Brackett Creek, down Jackson Creek to where it hits I-90, over to Kelly Canyon, and essentially to the fish hatchery. So anyone within this area is eligible for our hazardous fuels forest health program. So just give me a holler. My number is 522-4000, extension 3, or my direct line is 522-4012. More than willing to help. Love to get out on site, do what we can to help you folks out there. And that's something I should have mentioned right off the bat. Our hearts go out to you folks. We know it's a hard time, so we're here to try to help as much as possible. Just to let you know. What else do I have here? I want to touch base on. Oh, this is a list of approved forest health and wildlife safety program contractors. I will provide this to anyone who needs it. This is, I believe, from Extension. So Dominique had sent this our way a while back. So we do have some information on some folks, and we continually adding to the list. And like Peter said, I think it's really important for folks, if you have the opportunity to talk to your neighbors, try to get a plan for the whole area, for the drainage, or when you talk to a logger, like bring a group of people together. You have way more power when you come together. I think that's about all the information I had. I appreciate your time, and we are here to answer any questions. Thank you.
You mentioned banding together. If a whole neighborhood wanted to get together, can they become a single farm from a cost sharing perspective, or would they have to apply as a bunch of individual farms?
Yeah, they'll have to apply as individuals. We have to contract with one person with one farm, but I'm talking like we can have the same plan over property boundaries, so we could be doing the same thing for neighbors. And I think it's really helpful for them when they do talk to folks to do work on their land to band together.
I think that contractor wise, as well as kind of what you were speaking to, is like it's easier to get contractors out when there is more landowner interest in the area. Great.
So you mentioned removal of fuel loading. Does that also include removal of dead trees or salvage logging? Or is it exclusively?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the current tip we have is not for burn trees. We might be able to utilize some practices in there. We do have a practice for residue treatment. It would be stretching it quite a bit, but we are looking at other ways to help with some cost share. We understand it's not a cheap endeavor, and we want to try to do what we can on our end.
Sure.
Maybe we can look into that more because we do have the catastrophic wildfire or the catastrophic event scenario within the woodlands treatment as well. So something we could look into for sure.
So Ashley said they're going to look into that a little more. Others? Okay. Thank you.
So I put together just a few pictures of how the Bridger Fire expanded to give folks a view, because it's important to understand how fire behaves in order to really assess the damage that it does as well, and what happened. And, you know, if you're trying to learn from this, okay, you know, what is my risk and my potential with all of that? So, and again, this is, I mean, there's folks, I don't know where they're listening in from. If they're still online, you know, what prompted this is to assess the Bridger Canyon fire. And we're seeing more and more of these kinds of fires, wind-driven fires, that also hit heavy fuels. And those are really, really bad combinations to have. And so, you know, the other lesson on here is fuel management does work. It does help, not always. Are we up to go, ready to go?
We're rolling.
Okay, so you recall, this is the Bridger Fire on day one. When it started in this draw next to the M, and it's a steep ground, and there's a lot of dead beetle-killed trees up above it. Okay, so it started down, and it kind of, there was no stopping, because you can't put firefighters above a fire. It's too dangerous. If that fire blows up, they have nowhere to go. So the rule in firefighting, 1 foot in the black. So you fight it from behind, not in front. Okay, so this is afternoon. By evening, it come over the top. So this is now in Bridger Canyon, as it's kind of snaking its way down, and this is at this point still a fuel-driven fire. So the fuel loading determines how fast it's spreading. And where
What
it's
time is this now, this picture taken?
don't know for certain. I'm going to guess this is probably around 2 in the morning or so. And so here's a similar one. This is now taken from Bozeman, so you can see the M. And so this is in all that dead timber on both sides of the mountain. Okay, and so Bridger Canyon is behind here. Okay, and there's really two. There's a basin right behind here, and then there's the main canyon. So, and so this is what it's doing at night. High humidities, low temperatures, and for it to burn like this, it's got to have fuel. So, you know, you could say that if the fuels had been treated up there, you wouldn't have had this kind of a fire going on up there. Okay, so it was a lot of dead woody debris down timber. This is a popular recreation area, valued for its naturalness. Okay, so I'm not critiquing anything here. It just is what it is. And then the next day, the wind started picking up a little bit. And the backside of this mountain is all heavy, dense timber with a lot of beetle kill. Because 2005 to 2012, we had a mountain pine beetle epidemic that killed 80% of the lodgepole pine. And that back slope was about 60% lodgepole pine. So about 40% of the trees on that back slope were dead and had been curing and drying for a decade. Okay? When you start seeing black smoke, though, that means it's into live crowns, because it gets so hot that it's volatilizing the green organics in there, and the water is not burning at all. This smoke is actually very flammable because of all it's, you know, like evaporated diesel, sort of. Okay, and then the wind kicked in. Okay, so it started burning up the canyon, and then you see the smoke plume. Normally this plume would go straight up to almost 30,000 feet with all the energy in here, but it's laying down. And this is when everybody is, get out of the way. Because a wind-driven fire, you cannot be in front of it. And it moves fast. This can be moving at 10, 20 miles an hour through there. So, and it just got worse. Okay, and this is when, so this is the M's here, this is Bridger Canyon in here. So now the wind is blowing it not up canyon, but across the canyon. And to give you an idea, here's a picture that night. These are grass shrubs, and the flame should be straight up to there, but it's blowing horizontal, and this is the volatilized gases catching fire when it mixes with oxygen. Okay, so, and this is when it blew through this basin here. So all the grass, so this is the heavy timber that was burning with that heavy smoke plume, and then when the wind blew, it blew it this way across here. So this is where you folks live up in here. So And so then you have all these little side canyons that start funneling air. And the problem is when fire gets in there, it expands the air, and the air wants to rush out, and it rushes up the canyon. So you not only have wind, you have air rushing up the canyon. We call it a chimney effect. So this is what we're facing. And so this is, I just took this yesterday. A little bit of rain, you can see the grass is starting to come in. So the rangelands, really good. They're going to come back better than before, back for fence posts. The black, this is where the rehab needs to go. So, and amazingly, a lot of houses were saved because there were fire crews out there with lumber trucks on those houses. And you look at it now, you go, what on earth were you doing there? I mean, you could have died in that. So, you know, so this is the Bridger fire, and then it kind of stalled out up there because had the wind been blowing up the canyon, Bridger Bowl, it would have burned all the way to Battle Ridge. But the wind was actually blowing it to the east, actually southeast somewhat. And so in one place it blew it across the highway there, but the fire crews were there. They did a yeoman's job. Grass fire, you get water on it, you can put it out. When the timber's burning, you can only back off of it. And the problem is that when you have this kind of smoke, the aerial tankers can't go in there and do anything because they can't see anything. So I just wanted to throw that out there for folks that were watching that didn't know really what was going on. So with that, yes?
Can you go to the other slide you just had a second ago?
The fire? Yep.
No, the one that showed, yeah, that one.
Yeah.
So I looked quickly at the intensity map, and it would be great to get a link to that, that you showed earlier. A large portion of the most intense places, the most severe burns, are in that these lower hill.
I'll be a little bit careful in looking at that map, okay? So those maps are generated with satellite imagery, heat imagery, and so severity can be measured two ways, okay? It's either measured when the trees are torching out, that's usually high severity. But you can have green trees, and if it was a lot of burn on the soil, that's high severity. So there's severity on the vegetation and severity on the soils, and they don't necessarily match up. When I look at that, in my background experience, all of this is high severity. This right here is not high severity because the vegetation survives. So I look at severity, where is it going to recover relatively quickly? And the high severity is where it's not going to recover quickly. And so if I were personally to map this, and I've been out on the roads and looking at all that stuff, all of the black, everything I looked at, where you have black trees and all that, it's high severity because this time of year, that duff and that organic layer is bone dry. It all burned. If this were to burn earlier in the summer, that stuff would be wet and would not have burned. So you would have had high severity overstory, low severity understory. But considering how dry everything was, I personally disagree with, I haven't seen the map, I'd have to look at it. But again, those are generated using models and imagery, and they're good places to start from. But you go out on your property, you look at the soils, look at the vegetation, and it behooves you to make your own map of where the high severity is. Now NRCS, I mean, they cover a lot of stuff, and they have to make a case nationally because they get only so many dollars. Said, okay, so we're allocating this amount of money based on this map, which is created by this agency, that it is accountable. It doesn't mean that it's exact, okay? It's the best tools they have. But most of what I saw is high severity out there, other than the grassland. I'll just say that.
And the wind-driven nature of this that you described before, are you familiar with the Pine Creek fire? It burned about 12,000 acres just outside Livingston. This was kind of 2012, 2013.
Yes, yeah.
Was it a similar dynamic, do you know?
Well, again, it depends on the landscape. This was a similar dynamic to the Derby fire. The Derby fire started on the edge of south of Livingston, and it burned eastward across a lot of ranch land and private land and all those draws. And so that picture I showed you, the deep canyon with all the erosion, that was the Derby fire. And that was when the wind just howled that fire up canyons. And so sadly, I have some friends that worked on that. There were bears and deers caught in full run, killed by that fire, because the fire was moving faster than those animals could run. And that was a wind-driven fire. But wind-driven determines how fast it spreads. Fuel determines how severe it is. Okay? So, and yeah, the wind will increase the temperature. That's why you have air going into a blacksmith. The more oxygen, the hotter it gets.
So, two from online, Chris Mahony said the Forest Service produced a fire severity map and the NRCS helped ground truth it on the private land portion, since the FS only has jurisdiction over their own lands. And then there's a question online about aerial seeding. Are any agencies doing that perhaps on the Forest Service lands?
I don't know.
Or anybody who does that?
I doubt it, because a lot of that land is kind of roadless. So it's kind of let nature do its thing.
Yep.
And so they may, again, I'm not familiar with the matrix they're using to do severity. If it's lodgepole pine and it burns like this, they may not call it high severity, because that's within the natural range of lodgepole pine. But I'm just speaking without knowledge on this, okay? I'm puzzled why this would not be called high severity, because it is. Now, lodgepole pine, where it's there, it's going to come back pretty thick. And so you don't really need to do anything there, though on those steep slopes, you're going to get, erosion is a natural phenomenon. If you consider fire a natural phenomenon, the erosion afterwards is natural. And when Laird Creek blew out, that was a natural phenomenon, but the upper Laird Creek Basin lost all of its soil. The whole basin is down to bedrock. And it will never support the vegetation it had before. And that's a natural phenomenon. Is it good? Well, it depends on your perspective. For me, it wasn't. For the landowners below that got caught in the wall of mud and water that came down, it wasn't. But it all depends on what you're building into. What is it you're asking?
One last question, maybe you hit on this right at first, and I wasn't here, but I'm on the reclamation cleanup side of this. Colin and I are doing a lot of this work. Probably the biggest question I hear, and it's valuable information that you gave us on all the, what to look for and all that. But still, probably the largest question I have from homeowners is there somebody, who would you best contract to come look at trees, to mark off, to say, I mean, I understand the spots where there's, 50 plus acres of trees, that's a forester, that's everything. But on 5-10 acre pieces where there's, 24 trees, is there a resource besides, just your local arborist or something? Is there a resource where someone would come out, maybe even pay to have an authority come out?
Not that I'm aware of it. And I would say your local arborist usually doesn't know what to look at either. This is a unique phenomenon. It's a once in every couple of years. It's not something that supports an industry to do this kind of stuff.
Right.
If they only got a dozen trees, get the guide. Look at it. It's not that hard. Okay? Go assess your trees. If they're black, that's a no-brainer. If they're scorched, that's a little tougher. Okay? When in doubt, wait until the spring and see what comes out. The problem is, if you want to remove them then, that's okay if you're doing it by hand. But if you're going to run equipment on it, that's when all the stuff is growing, and that's when you don't want to be running equipment.
Well, see, that's what I'm, in all of this, people talk about, well, you have a year window. Well, you really don't. You really have 6 months here.
Yep.
Because, come spring breakup, you don't want to be
You don't want to be on it when it's wet. And so then there's next summer, and you can work on it. Okay, you can work on this forever or how long you want. I would definitely avoid it in the spring when the snow's melting. Okay, you can do a lot of damage then. But next summer you can work on it. It's just not optimal. The best time to do it is now. Okay, but Right, so but next summer, I mean, you can't get to it all now, next summer, it's not like you're gonna cause a disaster by going on it next summer. Wait till the soils are dry, that's all I would say. And you can work on it, it'd be better to work on it now. So, but use the guide, that's why it was created, to assess your trees. I mean, I have some landowners here I've been out with, it's not that hard, right? So, and if you're really in a bind, I'll be back down in October. Contact Dominique or the Extension Office or NRCS, and like them, I will make myself available to help folks here, because this is tough. And this is why we're here, is to help you. So, and there's plenty of trees I looked at and I go, no idea. I looked at all this, there's a lot of scorch on it. I don't see the girdling, so the stem is okay, but there was so much hot air around that tree, it's kind of unique, and it's just a question, how long did it bake? And so I'm finding a lot of the fine branches with needles are dead, but the bigger branches are alive. So is that enough for them to bud out and produce a new tree? I don't know, because I haven't seen this kind of phenomenon very often, and when I see it, it's in ponderosa pine, not Douglas fir. Usually the fires in Doug fir ecosystem, either the trees torch out or they don't. But to have this wind phenomenon that created this big mass of hot air that came across here, that usually doesn't happen in Douglas fir. And so, I mean, I'm scratching my head on a lot of trees. So, because I'm not certain what's going to happen there. I mean, they may or they may not. So the easy answer is wait till next spring, see if they produce new needles. The problem is if you have a logger in there, they're not going to come back for a few trees. So that's a tough call. And I mean, I'm glad you're here if this is your line of work, there's some things where, when in doubt, explain it to the landowner and let them decide. I mean, that with you, I'd say, well, maybe, maybe not. But, and if it's smaller trees, they're not that hard to take out. It's the big ones that are the issue. So I have one acquaintance, he's got 2 4-foot diameter trees up there that the base is alive, but the top is scorched so bad. But they're such valuable trees to be there. So they may decide to leave them and see what happens, and if they die, might have to get someone with a big chainsaw to drop them for them. Because Doug fir is pretty stable. This is a question I got that I didn't mention. If I leave them stand, how long will they stand? Dead. So Doug fir is pretty stable. The first thing that happens about halfway down the crown, the wood collects moisture and it rots out, so the tops break out of them. Okay? And that starts to happen about 3 years from now. Okay? And once the tops start coming out of those trees, you don't want to be in that forest. And they'll do that for 10 years. And then you'll have these tall stumps and poles that will slowly decay, and they're great bird habitat. The birds love the cavity nesters, the chickadees and the nuthatches and the woodpeckers and all that, but how much do you need? So even when you're salvage logging it, and that, again, look at the handout, I can go to more detail and a little more organized thought. You might want to leave some of those trees for wildlife. And there's trees that the mills don't want if you're salvage logging. There's nothing wrong with leaving some out there for woodpecker and bird habitat. They need that too. And again, there's wildlife adapted to use this. All right. Well, I think we've kind of burned out our brains here.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So thank you and good luck